Good morning, everyone, everybody. 다 ngadu pashu ngadu chati ora sound chachi de shui. 다 lungema ngacho langdwen la dindi deba nguni ma de chi tiberedi. Ge du da timaji chudinji tibero. Da didu gazu ji gezi she yume tanda ge tingi mindu. Shida din ji la da dari dindi deba nguni ma 만드셔 제신 그 뒤딩 가서 딘디도 연구니 마다 친요 말 문두기 지진다고 진가 소리 시바래 다디 다리야 딘디도 마시 공들라 지당기 가서 그래 낭주 지인도 당스러워 있는데 냐면은 지당기 출루 지인도 당 지제 딘디네마 딘디도 강준주지 다리 차고에 유지 말다 도스도스지마 야 추딩 신다든데 유나 딜라 티주로
I see. So Rinpoche said in Tibetan, well, welcome everyone in Tashitele. And so Rinpoche spoke about this particular text in praise of dependent arising or dependent origination by Lama Tsongkhapa. Rinpoche spoke about this text during his last visit in London. He gave a teaching on this subject. However, Rinpoche doesn't exactly remember how far he got while teaching this. I mean, he has no memory of like exactly how much he actually covered. What he remembers is that he gave a general kind of explanation. He gave some in general background with regard to the text. So for today, well, what Rinpoche would like to do would, again, he would like to give some kind of introduction, a general explanation, kind of introducing some introductory words about the Dharma, and then from there, then continue with the text or start the text. But Rinpoche says, well, I don't need to finish. I don't need to finish the entire text today, so we can take it slowly, and Rinpoche can give you the necessary kind of introductory explanation.
지당니 출루 상매 디오 주야 지당 디오 구마 단단가랑 소라 강 유신비 디오 딜레다 제보다 파베 디오 지 주야 지당 동예 세기 타낭지 송용구도 하다 디 출루 상매 지버리샤
In general, when we look at the different religions, the different spiritual systems, well, their aim is basically to bring happiness to people, to bring happiness to living beings, and not just ordinary happiness, but a special type of happiness. That's their goal. And at the same time, they also aim towards reducing beings' sufferings, reducing their problems, reducing their difficulties, and so forth.
다 디오 루야의 동예 세기 타랑지 송용구 요디다 타랑 민다오지 송용구도 타랑 민다오디 가르치하고도 쓰나 지당 지에 있는 출루다 좋은다오지 칸니다오지를 이어 다 시차우지는 망부시에 요디 지당지는 카슈다오지 니 수르지 다 디오 동예 디오 세야당 가사 동예 세야다 디오 루야디 조디 군주를 띵치시니 군주를 一切得把自己的节气呢，哎，关注给各的多节气呢，关注给各出现多，关注了一切得把自己的节呢，得我主要的东亚些的关注给突击个人了的呢，关注给新了了的呢，用过去吧，说关注让给，但得我东亚给当真的，关注给做几个吧，今天几个大陆几个图呢？ 关注了一切地方节等，关注了古学节等，说的呀等，他关注给干死了为因的，他关注给干了自己定这个老些提出这两年前，我定这几送来进度啊。
Now, when it comes to bringing about happiness and removing suffering, well, there are different methods prescribed. Different methods are introduced in the different religious systems or spiritual systems. Now, in general, all religions, all spiritual systems can be categorized into two, can be classified into two categories. Of course, there are many other categories, but in general, just roughly speaking, we can categorize them into two. So one category is that of believing in a creator God. So some religious systems, the first category, includes all religious systems that believe in a creator God, where faith is most important. Faith in the creator, in what the creator says. So basically, it's through the instructions God gives, through the blessing of God, of this creator, that happiness is brought about, or happiness is created while suffering is removed. So the word of God, that what God teaches, that lies at the forefront, and it's faith in these teachings that is most important. And it's so therefore through respect, through supplications directed at God, then well-being is brought about. So this brings about the well-being of sentient beings. And it's basically God that controls everything. It controls sentient beings' happiness and sentient beings' suffering.
다 디와 동에 참아 군주기 마 남규여바 딘데지 뇌킨 이너레 민뇌킨기 출루 임바 이너레 간더 출루 파다기 샴바다 지와 하장기 계진부 지기도와 샹시디베 출루 참마기 러시아 조우디 지인구도 디도 참마 군주기 마 낭기리 송kin기 지딘 고부분 되kin기 출루지 차천바 이네야 러시아 서부 휴지 자용구도 배나 지딘 탄제 군주기 준바레스 라그마도 야부디조 군주기 제벌에 두자디조 군주기 제요 말쓰기미도 나서 소자 탄제 군주기 준바레스 미리 탄제 군주기 준바레 도시에 윤리가 다 탄제 군주기 가서 그래 준바지당 나라서 미지를 찾으면 있는 미탄지 군주기 제వ 인디가는 참모도 군주기 세순듯이 그 군주 참모도 군주기 세순을 차인 거로 미장지순을 차인 거로 그디 디양고 러제 쳐 친구도 어제 쳐 친구 자인 거래 뒤준도想不到自我设的 출路기 러제 조지了다 출路참에 송용 신로 뉴버 방야당 좀 아시아당 덴바치고야당 수진송야당 저거 공고야당 디수데디 창명이 러잖아 내용도 실디 러친부지 차디오래상도
Yes. Now, when we talk about the category, well, the category of spiritual systems or religions that accept a creator God, well, as said earlier, the assumption is that God brings happiness, brings suffering. Then you have other spiritual systems that are part of the second category, which do not believe, which do not accept a creator God, which do not believe that God is responsible for suffering and happiness and so forth. But what both categories, so all religions, have in common is their belief in the effectiveness of love and compassion, the importance of love and compassion. Those are seen as most important. So of course, when we look at the systems that believe in a creator God, that follow the teachings of God, for instance, there are a lot of great explanations, and they all involve the teachings on love and compassion. Now, here the idea is that God created living beings, created human beings, created everything. And so implied by that also creating suffering, creating happiness. But the main point is that we were all created by God, and in a way, we're God's children. We are all part of one family. So these teachings are really pervasive. They're really far-reaching, and in the sense that despite that, on top of that explanation, what is most important are love and compassion, the teachings on love and compassion. So teachings on how to avoid harming others, teachings on not lying. So there are a lot of explanations on why one shouldn't lie, one should be truthful, one should abide by ethical morality, be patient, etc. All this is based on the idea of a creator God. Um, and again, all trade on the in this case on the creator God, but in other cases, even without the acceptance of God, love and compassion are what are seen as most important.
我呢，군주세디 상제세디 구마레스 러디간라 디 마레 상제 종딘데 디 가수기 겐라다보지 디오두야기 털랑 땡킨다 둥에시야기 털랑 땡킨기 랑땡보보 랑가 땡킨 수레디 딘데기 더 기여신이 겐라 자고르마도 군주기 샤니마 디오낭투 마르 군주기 샤기 가수기 둥에디 파도스 세야디 마레 시지네 단 지딘 고보 민저긴 수이 딘데지 송는 것도
And then the other category, in particular, when we talk about Buddhism, well, it's the category of those who don't believe in God, who don't accept the existence of a creator God. And in those systems, in particular in Buddhism, um, you find the explanation, of course, of suffering and happiness being created, but being created by our own self, that we ourselves create our suffering, we create our happiness, and it's basically our own responsibility. It lies within our own hands, what we create, what kind of experience we have, and we have to make an effort to bring about these experiences we like and avoid those we don't like. And it's all of this is dependent on the mind. Happiness and suffering rely on the mind. They were created by the mind. Therefore, a creator God is not accepted simply because it's not necessary. There's no one who creates our suffering. Of course, the question may arise, well, what do you need Buddha for instance? Like the kind of main being in other religions, it's God, for instance. Well, in Buddhism, it's Buddha. Is there no need for Buddha? And in answer to that, well, the answer to that is that Buddha is seen as a kind of teacher, as a guide, as someone who shows us the path, who shows us exactly how we should act, what we should avoid, and so forth. However, Buddha, different from the concept of God, Buddha cannot remove our suffering. We can only do this ourselves. So Buddha, therefore, said that he cannot take away our suffering, for instance, cannot give us happiness with his own hands.
다 지당 나무 마인베 지딘 고보 민주의 긴기 출루디 요요래 배나 진기 출루 지법이 출루다 버딘데 요다 요디 조디다 남바 순르지 차용고도 진다 남바지 디 나니자 다 남바디 지딘 고보 민주의 긴다 슈침부 차용고래 다 남베기 따로 시작이네 송용디간라 간드르 두니에세디 레기 왕기 용구여봐 레디야 녀모비 왕기 사요다 레세디 단다 주디 사제기 레로 고여다 두니에세디 레기 수수수기 쥐바 기당을 하래 그래서 딘다부지 구구거다 레스러드가 자월러스고라 자주라 쥐바 수수수 쥐바를 하래 그래서 예수지 레를 하래 그래서 레디 가려wan기 쥐바디 간테스 용고스 쥐바디다 공농 기당 녀모 녀모 병wan기 쥐바 기당이라고 용고레스 이네 간들 둥에세디 레라래 유바 사제기 레스 그리다 도즈 시사부진 러위는 사제기래 사제기 레디야 녀모 병wan기 사그레스 디 딘데기 좀 벌써 송고도 다 녀모 세딩 알아서 세나 유디베 뉘샤시당 아제 차도세 디수레티 샤리고로
No sé. Now, of course, there are other non-Buddhist, there are other systems other than Buddhist systems that don't believe in the existence of God. For instance, the Jain tradition. However, of those traditions who don't follow, who don't believe in God or a creator God, Buddhism is one of the main systems. It's a very strong view that Buddhists hold when it comes to the existence of a creator of all sufferings, a creator of ourselves, and so forth. Now, as to the creation of suffering, so how's our suffering created? Where does our suffering, where do our problems come from? Well, from a Buddhist point of view, they were created by karma. And here, karma in particular, contaminated karma, as it's called. So it's basically our own action. Rinpoche says, well, you could literally say our own actions, our own behavior is responsible for our problems, for our difficulties. And our behavior, in turn, is controlled by our mental afflictions. So basically, karmic actions or volitional actions, they were created by a particular intention or motivation. We had a particular intention or motivation to do something, and that motivation is controlled by our mental afflictions. So, in other words, where do our problems come from? Where does our suffering come from? From our contaminated karma. Contaminated in the sense that it's controlled by our mental afflictions. So, therefore, our actions being controlled by our mental afflictions, that then leads to suffering. And these mental afflictions, they include attachment, aversion, um, jealousy, envy, and so forth.
다 가서 디지상 당고도 동해디 레기 왕기 용거에 세디 레기 왕기 용거에 세디야 고 노트지 차소나 디 디지그래 가서 그래 상제 중딩데 코랑기 동해 레기 왕기 용거에 세기 상제기 송야기 된다 뭐마디 콘도 취마도 차그래 제가 디인디가 동해 디 레지 온기 용거세기 남베 따츠디 디 된다디로 따츠디 칸데레스로 디간라 다 동해 디 레지 온기 용거에 송야디 디송요레 레세디 나랑수기 자와지 다 나랑수기 자주에라 류가 이송기 자주 디송마도 요마다 류가 류긴 레스그레 나기 레스그레 이지 레스그레 다 간다 류가 이송기 자오드리 다 동해 디 류가 이송기 자주에단 대화 간데스 요레스로 디간라 나중에 라산 디리스타마이나 베나 지원디 신디기 동해 참마 신디기 류 담보 람바 디넨 구주네 레요르다 지원디기 동해 참마 미친디기 동해 참마 가든 구주 버렸으나 지원디 류딘디 가두 람바 있는 람비 뒤에 디넨 구주디 용바 다 류딘디 라면은 류딘디를 때문에 동해디 유행요 말어 세상 류딘디 투마 람바 디넨 구주 버리 디 람바 딜레 때네 아니 친디기 동해디 지기지를 구상마 지어지 용데 다 류딘디네 랑양 랑베 구디네 주네 친디기 동해디 주용규여 인디가라 류딘디 간데스 람바레스 지원디 간데스 람바레스 로디가라 다 레시 다 레간데스 로디가라 지워라 지워 장부당 지워 니버니 마돈도 사요 말어 지네 장이니 시고로 당가서 디시고르다 코너 코킹기 신진스 거다 콜 타이 타벤 주단디 랑공니 두고로 랑세버지 공니 코랑코랑 양 주단 베트 카가치레 단 지딘렌 데베 랑기 나샤스 거디 디 베트 가소레 캐티그라사 가사 인지기 나도
Category. Category.
캐티그리 베트 카가레 다디쿠 지딘렌 데베 캐티그리 디 파샤 다 지딘렌 데베 디 마시버지 나랑수 단덴 주단디 시버이나 단덴 주단 디기 나라 지워딜 지워 장부지다 지워 님버지 니마돈 주사민도와 다 지네 님버스라디 가서 그 두자레스 딘데 게제 말에 강에 망부여바당 아니 생을 땐베 강에 망부여바 다 나생기 내당 배는 가서 밀레 장 류신니가 내당 조조여바디 둔주기 내당 답으로 다 뒤줄라고 지네 님버스지라고 그래 그래서 지네 장이 니마돈 주사요 다 지네 장부다 님버니디 가르왕기 용거레스 지네 장이디 콜 주지고 그래서 거다 今年上部的他是能给东北去了嘛啥用的？今年度假的他是个就没见面，可能听我买米举起是个的，听我买米举起没不起呢？这不人不的，这不上不的用心个嘛的，现在今年上年的就上年了来个的，来上年速的解决，就把上年的什么上年的了来个的，的送用。
No sé. Now, when we talk about we create our own suffering, that needs to be understood correctly, because if we don't understand what it means, what karma means, what karmic actions refer to, then it's very difficult to understand what the Buddha has taught. Therefore, it's so important to understand what are we talking about here when we say karmic actions. Well, karmic actions are actions of body, speech, and mind. Those are described volitional karmic actions or volitional actions of body, speech, and mind. Those are karmic actions. Now, if we look at our own life, if we consider our own life, our own situation right now, all our problems, where did all our problems, our difficulties, when did they start? Well, they started with our birth, our conception in this life, having received this particular body. All our troubles started with having the body we have right now. This is kind of the, as it says in Tibetan, the physical basis for all our difficulties. And so having had this, having received or having been born with this particular body, well, um, and our problem starting with that, well, where did this body come from? Where did we get this body? And of course the mind that goes along with this body, where do they come from? And the answer to that is karmic actions from the past. Certain karmic actions we engaged in, they gave rise to this category of rebirth we find ourselves in, which is considered to be a positive kind of rebirth. In general, um, there are two categories. There's a positive rebirth, and then there's a negative rebirth. Now, when we talk about positive and negative, we're not talking about positive in the sense of having overcome samsara. This is a different category altogether. So those who practice the path, engage in the different practices that lead us beyond samsara, beyond this cyclic existence, that's totally different. But here we're talking about within cyclic existence, within samsara, there are positive and negative rebirth. Now here, negative doesn't mean we're not talking about a person being bad or a person being uh, a negative kind of person as such, but it's just about the problems. Here a bad rebirth or a negative rebirth is described as such because of the many problems and difficulties the person finds themselves in, the being finds themselves in. So a lot of mental problems and a lot of difficult circumstances they find themselves in. And so where does that come from? Where do all these existences come from? What is their cause? They didn't just fall from the sky, but they didn't just happen randomly,
No.
but instead, um, positive and negative rebirth, they all happened as a result of a cause. So negative actions, negative causes, therefore, so harmful actions, they lead to similar experiences in the negative kind of rebirth, while positive causes, beneficial causes, they give rise to rebirth that are of a positive type. So it has to do with our mind. It all comes together, or it all boils down to what kind of attitude we have and what do our mental states, what do they lead to, what actions do they lead to, which then result in either a rebirth with more sufferings, more problems, or a rebirth with lesser problems.
嗯，现在今年上年底来上年了，让给呃绝不当，你绝不的过年龙节给上路了，让来个的是，他啥节一来的，数据跟他们牛木单条要了，牛木单条要嘞，变了米给来因不因呢？米了牛不节给顶着一来送的钱不因那地公龙的了空主当对家送的俺家送的几原因不了。他的满意不是，嗯叔叔让你去亚布中央的，顶这个上路的托呢，来当地那个了，当俺说当的书记，当地那个了，俺说来亚布去啥玩意那样？ le ya bu sa ba yin ya di su 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 gi duen da la cha bi cha sin ji gi gu nian lang di jie yong go re so di yin di gang la duen xia dan ji yong go ro nga zu dan de ne ge le sa yong di gang la nyo mo ba da man ji ba ji ji le sa ra gi wo ma re so di ne yin di gang la karsa di xie jie di duen la ja ka xie le xie xin tu zhe qi de 아니 디인디강라 레 레디 그 쥐버라시 쥐버세디 상동 나중에 생기 쥐버디 semba 야부 semba 두자세디 생기 쥐버던디 디고라다 류가기 쥐버디지 디수제디 용주기 공년 롱제디 상로 동당다라리 그래서 세상 디레 디인디강라 사제기레 사제기 쥐버 디수제디 아니 묘몽보단 저 요래 세디 어디 투네래 그래서 내 인디가라 디두세디 주장이 러디는 제부디와 동에 연구해 봐 지워 장부의 지워 님버 세디 레장이 투네 연구해 봐 레장이 니부디 상동당라라 레기여 봐 묘몽보단 제디기여 봐 단대네 거는 하나 속이 레디 나수기 레 가르치 묘몽보다 만지버지 제사라고 말잖니 배 녀모 배 녀모로 공부 치다 취지니 가르치네 녀모든지 녀모 슈 춘조이네 녀모든지 쇼고다 그래서 드네 인자 다 중에세디 레기 왕기 용고래 레디 어 녀모비 왕기 용고래 세기 상노 동당기 지기 코다부디 지기 동다부디 지당기 가서 그래 코 두단다부디 카슌다부디 어딘데 지기 돈에 상당거디 공회 내주 yin mi chuba kemi duwa di. Ngoyi ne sui la tindaji rugi yuwe suna chi nga tsu soto yen duwa.
I see. Now, basically, therefore, our actions, our karmic actions or our behavior, all boils down to our own attitude. It's our attitude, it's our way of thinking, it's the way we the kind of thoughts we have that is responsible for the actions, for the resulting actions. And so our actions are described to be contaminated. Why? Because they're controlled by our mental afflictions. In the case of non-virtuous karmic actions, so in that case, usually it's anger, it's aversion, attachment, arrogance, and so forth. These are kind of the motivating forces, the motivating mental afflictions. But even in the case of positive actions, even in the case of contaminated positive actions, it's because of our self-centered mind, our wish to benefit ourselves more than anyone else. That leads to positive actions, although they are still controlled by mental afflictions, controlled by our attachment for ourselves. But so in that way, therefore, it's the afflictions that basically control our life. And Rinpoche then said, well, sorry, he's slightly distracted because some Indians came and they talked to Rinpoche. But anyway, when we talk about karmic actions, therefore, so our behavior is the result of actions, or of is can be divided into physical, verbal, and mental actions. And their root is really our attitude, is our way of thinking. And that way of thinking is negatively affected by our afflictions. Now, that being the case, that kind of mechanism is responsible also for where we end up in our next life, or where we're, for instance, where we're born in this life. So our existence in this life, whether it's positive or negative, it all boils down to our previous attitude and to the afflictions that controlled our actions in the past. Now, these afflictions are extremely powerful. I mean, even if we engage in positive actions, we cannot escape these afflictions. These afflictions influence all our actions. They're ever present. They influence everything we do, basically. So therefore, it's the afflictions that affect our mental states, and those in turn affect our actions and particular outcomes. That's a kind of a general mechanism, and it's not that hard to understand that this is in accordance with reality. This is how that this is basically what controls our own life.
다 Tine indi la ta diwa dungen seye di susu la ra legir seye di susu ki dungen ki zawa di pu de so na kawa yores lo di la susu sengi gang yores ta sengi gang lo yeju ki dungen ki zawa di kare lo di la dungen la cha chenpa yina dungen ki zawa di sen ma rong di res ta nyomo sikar ta nambe shongi nanglo la simba duja di la nyomo simi ta sher ta nyomo res ta sen ma nyomo la nyomo jechi ji tong siye jine shivu ji janga mambu tsiye yor di su du du ji jine nambe shong la fong di nga la zanyu chu nye nyomo ba nishu siye je sungu duwa disu je ta disu tsama ki nyomo disu ngun zine nyomo disu tsama ki pe tsawa nangi tsawa tabu di kare sila di nga la dadan zimba dangzen mari bar di res nga siye ki dadan zimbe lu di res ta nga wunyambe lu di 다 깔래 카부디 온디카 두디 워다 나 오냐미 루차마 나가 세기 상루 차마 두자리려나 딜라마 되지 딜라도 말해 나 오늘 딘제기베 뇽모 차마기 자와 인kin기 단젠디 간데 지오레스로디가 아니 나 세기베 가서 음 나디 나란수기 수부기 지도바지라 지가 차부치 만도 수고가 침바이나 수북이 나로를 판도 是这个情不一样去拉不推约定你说的去拉边都是嘛土个情不一样土推约定说的今天一边我让家我是我说杨梅那去告诉我我电报啊今天一我让出土吧说判都是被那个苏不下军了不去打下去打 풍부가스 왔다가 수지 풍부 저의 풍부스 풍부가스 기초만도 스 동부동부 또 지지네 망고가 침바인 오 딩하르다 세기 지수 나론 수지 된주 여바 따부기 나 짐바징 아출의 요레스 가르스라딩 아주 콩글라 뇌자 침부지 엔다나 생기 차도 슈침부지 딘데 집에 가도라 디거 뒤뒤기 nga 세기 상루디 시우지베 차부 두나신 시우디기도 두나신 셰자 거뒤 nga 덴바와 nga 랑자원 짐베 nga 랑신지 주번 짐바 다 nga 랑신지 주번 짐바 순디기도다 오 딘데긴 짐바 딜레디고레스 디송고르세 딘데긴 짐바디다 뇨모 용주기 자와레스 뇨모 신 상마긴 되자 콘두 ngaje chadu ani dana singi ka nusin nosin loda lasu nyomo chama gi zawo diris
I see. This means that our happiness, our suffering is all dependent on us. So what is the root, therefore, of our happy experience, our pleasant experiences, and our unpleasant experiences? It's our own mind. That is the root of everything. It's a kind of mind in particular that is not appropriate, that is harmful. We're talking about here a kind of mind that is harmful, that causes all our problems. It's a negative kind of a bad kind of mind, if you like, which really refers to the mental afflictions. So the mental afflictions, they are responsible for all our problems. They give rise to our suffering. They give rise to our limited kind of ordinary happiness. And when we talk about the mental afflictions, well, in the text, there are 84,000 different mental afflictions prescribed, or the text at least mentioned these 84,000 different mental afflictions. But in short, they can be divided into two categories, into the 6 primary mental afflictions and into the 20 secondary mental afflictions, or the 6 root mental afflictions and the 20 secondary mental afflictions. But the root of these, so all the different afflictions that are described in the text that arise in our own mind, well, their root, they have another root, like a kind of a root cause that gives rise to the different types of afflictions, and that is called the ignorance of grasping at the self. Now, the mind that thinks I. Well, the mind that thinks I in and of itself is not necessarily negative. Here we're talking about an extreme kind of mind. We're not just talking about a mind that perceives I, but a mind that exaggerates the existence of our own self, of our own mind. in particular when we talk about a mind grasping at the self. So there is a sense that there is an I, a concrete and solid I, that we could actually find, that somehow in our body contains the self, this I. And if we were to look for it long enough, we would be able to find it and actually touch it. We would be able to point it out and say, well, this is the I. So that's a kind of sense of an I that exists truly, that exists self-sufficiently. It's like some kind of autonomous I that exists somewhere within our mind, our body. So here we talk about our psychophysical aggregates, the five aggregates as they usually described. So these five aggregates, which basically refers to our mind and body, there's a sense if we were to take these five aggregates and take them apart mentally or physically cut them into pieces, or mentally kind of take them apart, we would be able to find a self. There's a sense that there's this I that is findable. There's this solid I, something we can point at. There's a very strong feeling, in particular when certain mental afflictions manifest, such as anger, when we feel angry, when we have afflicted desire, when we have attachment, when we're envious, and so forth. And in those moments, at those times, there's a more pronounced sense. There's a stronger sense of the I is right there. There's something very solid there. And that I appears as autonomous, as findable, as inherently there, as naturally inherently there. So Rinpoche said we can even use the word, it feels as if the I was there inherently existent. And that sense of I, that holding on to such an I, gives then rise to attachment to the I, it gives rise to arrogance and so forth, which then in turn leads to the creation of different karma. Rinpoche, Rinpoche, unmute 직진하러나. 네.
다 디인 디간라 둥에기 짜오야 덴도 디간라 단진라 투그레 세디 남베기 남베 주담하고 용주기 디 다츠디 지바레 로 다디 단진라 투그레 세 게제 시행이 디 남바마도 하나 종유사 말을 나르기 출루기 나로라 다 둥에기 짜오 대침바이나 단진라 투그레 세디 시에윤디간라 남바 용주기 둥에기 짜오 단진레스 디인디 단진디 신지로기 로레스 간이스 쿠이 강에티고 강에팅이 루디르 루 노트리스고라 나서 그래서 신지로기 루인사 신지로기 루 로신인사 다든 셈바티기 루디 노트리기 루인사 쿠이기 셈바 나시기 다디 요마레스 단진기 nzimbe dadi yomare dame bare si dame gi tadu di shu chimbu sonye di otirida.
Yes. Therefore, the root cause, the main cause of all our trouble, of all our problems, all our sufferings, is this mind that holds on to a self. Now, of all the different Buddhist systems, the different tenet systems, they all agree that this wrong perception of the I is the main perpetrator, is mainly responsible for our other afflictions and therefore for all our trouble. Now, this is unique to Buddhism, at least when it comes to the ancient traditions. None of the other traditions describes this misperception, this misconception of the I as being the root of all our sufferings. Now, from a Buddhist point of view, that kind of grasping at the I, that kind of mind is a wrong consciousness. It's a mistaken mind. It's wrong. Why? Because its object doesn't exist. Its object is actually perceived in a way that does not accord with reality. Therefore, it's a wrong mind. It's a mistaken mind that gives rise to our suffering.
That's courage. I
see. So some Indians came to Rinpoche's room and they're working right now, and I guess it's quite dusty because of the work they're doing.
Yeah.
So Rinpoche's wearing a face mask.
다 가족이 상동에 대 가르레스로니까라 동해디 레장이다 레장이디 삼바장이 토니 용규여버디 삼바장이스네 다 뇨모던 진이 용규여버디 가수 고지 렌투 그래 그러와 동해디 가수 쥐발을 하래 그래서 가수 쥐버디 상동다 하래 그래서 또 러용 거로 그래서 생게 나로는 되차당 아제의 차도 뒤줄래 윤디가라 가수 수부톤의 자주 종해야 된 것도 좋은 거로. 그래서 뒤에 디인디가라다 레디 디네마 대치네 되차다 가제의 차도 뒤수제디 신지로기 단생기 왕기 간데스 용그레스 단생기 왕기 되차 간데스 이그레 단생기 왕기 가제 간데스 이그레 단생기 왕기 차도 간데스 용그레스 이지네 단생기 차당 간데스 점버지 이그레스 따디상당고
Yes. So that is basically the kind of view, the kind of Buddhist view when it comes to the root cause of our suffering. So basically, you have karmic actions, you have a certain behavior, which arises from our mind, which in turn comes from, well, harmful kind of attitudes, beneficial attitudes, all rooted in uh, the afflictions, that is, in the root afflictions, holding on to a self that doesn't exist the way it appears to the mind or the way it's conceived by the mind. Now, basically, you have mental afflictions such as attachment, you have mental afflictions such as arrogance. There are these many different types of harmful mental states, all arising from grasping at a self. And the question that then arises is, how does this self-grasping mind give rise to anger? How does it give rise to aversion? How does it give rise to attachment? How does it give rise to arrogance? And so forth. So how are these mental afflictions induced by the root affliction? The root affliction, which is the grasping at an I that doesn't exist.
다디 가서 노스 내다 라바지 가서 배치를 단다 최 티투그레 상도 가서 이제交통을 상도 내다 시 차부 주제디 수수수 상도 시비 상나 마도 치기 돈에 라토야 기타熊给나는 치민다고 비제 당는 시제에 대요 뒤에 편투그레디 이내 자자 장니버니에디 수수 상동네 마도 도스칼레 카버레 상도 이내 지당 김도 당 제버이나 그나 단생기 왕긴 되자 간데 시그리 시당 간데 시그리 슬러딩알라 다디 도지 가서 가사 최바 어디 인사를 상상이 가서 이게 디 슬루를 차투그레 도 다칼레 카부티자 메베토니 가레 슬러딩알라 페나 미지 수수를 뛰어담이나 그 나라 야부지도 세지 나라 야부지도 세들다 이제 양수수기 판도 선담의 통용디가라 야부지 통화이나 nye yabu tong song susugi yabu tong di zawa la xiani di xi la xiani o nye yabu tong song nye yabu tong song xie zang ku yabu re si jine ani dine be ku yabu re si jine dine yabu xi wu jin ba cha tan je ne yabu yin ba re ji tong yong ji jine ani de cha ji yong do xie zang nga la yabu ji do nye yabu tong do nga la yabu ji do nye yabu tong do si jine de cha ji gu ma do 나라 야부지기도 세 말아보지 오 강사신라 야부지기도 안되자지기도 강사신라 두자지기도 나 kundu사기도 라바이나 따디 주진 지메 차로 그래 와 그래서 딘디 나 세긴 차단이부디 나 세기 루던 저여버디 세우시 그랬도
No. Now, to talk about how basically well how this self-grasping mind, how then that gives rise to the afflictions, well, there are two versions of this type of explanation. One version is a coarser version that is relatively easily understood. And then there's also a subtler version. The subtler version is more difficult. Now, of course, it can be explained, it can be verbally explained. However, to fully understand it, to understand it 100%, you need to really make an effort. You need to reflect on it, analyze it to get a full understanding of the second, the more subtle explanation. So let's just cover the first explanation. How does our misperception, our misconception of the I give rise to afflicted desire, attachment, aversion, and so forth? So this is what follows is the kind of the rougher, the coarser kind of explanation, which is relatively easily understood. Well, let's look at a situation when someone praises us or someone says something positive about us. There's right away the sense this person benefits me. Or when I see something beautiful, there's a sense I consider this to be beautiful. This looks beautiful. Now, in these two scenario, in these two situations, the self is involved. In these two scenarios, the self is involved. The self is the basis. Now, in particular, when there's a sense, oh, this is all great, this is all wonderful, giving rise to attachment. Now, in this case, it's always in relation to the I. It's always in relation to this is good for me. Someone praises me. I consider this to be beautiful. This is great because I like it. The I is somehow always involved. In contrast, if you think about another person, like someone totally unrelated to you, if this other person, if someone benefits that other person, if someone harms that other person, anger doesn't arise, attachment doesn't arise. It doesn't give rise to attachment when someone benefits that person. Rather, attachment, aversion, and so forth, they only arise in relation to the self. They're in relation to I and mine.
다 세상电影就讲了对区位呢두당 din내라고 차디기도 남변 두당한테 내가 동행이 이제 저기 간라 이제 지자 용거도 세상다 다음에 따로 송야디 투서디 다음에 따와 매바이나 다음에 마공바이나 아니 당진 까투요 말에 매버수도 말에 당진 매버수마도나 차당로 수배 너무신 매버수도 말에 디수마도나 차당기 군의 상배 령하기 쥐바티 레디 까투 말에 디까마토나 지워장이 랭야디 까투 말에 단대가랑 수기지 단대가수 미기 지워디 지워 장부 제일 지워래 레디 미기 지워디야 라와메버 지워디 신뢰에 대한 가서 라와메버 신뢰들이 그래서 라와메버 지워도 시워디 차당 용왕기 레사 레디 용왕기 좀 지워 참말라 라와메버 지워 라와메버 시워서 그래 그래서 디 방토 말에 다 라와메베 지워다 라와메베 시오니부디 까마투베 린라 둥에 문제가 있나야 둥에 랑경하게 용되지 그 라와메베 지고야 그런 둥에 랑신 가두시마시 라와메메디베 디양 둥에 랑신 세상 다나 신기 진신 나주지를 때네 수둥에 내용하죠 디양 까더요 말이스 배나 네 나사다부지 수직인 되기요 말디 랑경하게 줄래요 거라 세상 디수제디 라메버 지워도 시워디 빵마토장 용바레스 시 딘데 인디가라다 투서 참말로 투야디 다메베 따오 공해딜 투디샤스 다메베 따오딜 투디샤스 어디 리시제고도 다 딘디가라 다메세디 게이치무차인 거다 다메 리시자야다 다메베 된다 딘디시자야디 다메버딜라 다 다음에 차슈디 랑신지 매바 딜라 띵종기 디쿠나니 미다니 띵진 저원종이 디쿠나니 시지네 다 도시에 송용 거다.
Now, in short, therefore, it's important to understand how the self actually exists and how our sufferings, our happiness, how they all arise from a particular type of mind. So here, our ordinary happiness, our suffering, they all arise from this particular mind. And so without understanding that this mind is mistaken, without understanding that grasping at the self is a mistaken mind, and without understanding that the self, the way we perceive it, doesn't exist, we won't be able to overcome our afflictions. We won't be able to overcome our problems. Our attachment cannot be stopped. Our aversion cannot be stopped. Our karmic actions cannot be stopped. So the contaminated actions we usually engage in, they cannot be stopped. And in fact, we won't be able to overcome samsara. Now, well, we were born in samsara. We were born in cyclic existence as a human being, which in general is considered to be a positive rebirth. But nonetheless, it is a samsaric rebirth. It's a rebirth that lacks freedom. So it's said to be in the nature of suffering because we have no real freedom. We cannot decide when we're going to die. In fact, actually, samsaric existence is described as this lack of freedom. There's no freedom. There's no way in which we can decide where we're going to be reborn, when we're going to be reborn, and when we're going to die. And on top of that, we constantly have experiences we don't like. Again, there's no freedom. There's no choice. There's no way to determine what's going to happen to us tomorrow. On top of that, our experiences, even our ordinary happiness, is in the nature of suffering. Therefore, to stop this, I mean, to stop these experiences, to transform these experiences, there's nothing else but to understand. There's no other option or no other method other than realizing that the self doesn't exist the way it appears to us. So the way it's conceived by our mind, the way it appears to us, we need to understand that that is unrealistic, and that is very important. It's extremely important to understand how the self really exists. And so, how can it be understood? Well, by understanding the suchness, the actual nature of the self, which is also described as the suchness of dependent origination. So that's the term that is used. In order to understand how the self actually exists, we need to understand the suchness of dependent origination.
다 디인디 간라 다메디 다 남베 따주기 나로라 다메베 따주 개치슈티 차인 거래 차고에기 주센디 어디로 투디 거래 다 레디 다메기 리시 자윤디 간라 아니 남베 나로라 리시 자다 민다오요다 다메 차라기 강사기 다메 추기 다메세 시라마와단 두디바 다부 차스요나 강사기 다메 마두시 말에 강사기 다음에 짱 공네 다 타바도 탄제 신부 두레 송고래 가서 따와게 나로르다 다 자치의 랑지를 머리 국가가로 자치의 랑지를 뭐 유비 투네다 따와 공해디 다음에 강사기 다음에 짱래 강사기 다음에 띠야 디르다 강사 주다 고마 우마바 더 신장베 대버이는 라버레세기 강사 랑자도 제기 동어디 공고로 다 신장보다 우마버니기 취지 강사기 다음에도 취지 다음에서 니시 这样区级大面的超我题，但区级大面那样查拉些的，但我们别个了区级大面来查拉些的，我现在听这个没着急，用过多的，干啥听这些，听这些是没去用的个，但做的开始了的讲了的，多军的些位呢，去趟街上先去做个要嘛的生意，但那边大面边这些。人们突出的因素，但我做第四下去的些位呢，现在做那个项目过去。
I see. Therefore, one of the most important Buddhist views is the view of selflessness. That is one of the most important kind of concepts that need to be understood. Now, there are different explanations when it comes to selflessness. There's selflessness of the person, there's selflessness of phenomena other than person. And when you look at the different philosophical systems, such as the Vaibhashika as well as the Sartantrika, these two philosophical schools, well, they only talk about selflessness of person. They do describe a path that leads to liberation, that leads to liberation from samsara, but according to these two Buddhist philosophical systems, well, you need to realize only the selflessness of person in order to overcome samsara. or that's all that can be understood, the selflessness of person. Whereas the Chittamatra and the Madhyamika school, the two higher philosophical Buddhist tenet systems, they also include selflessness of phenomena other than the person. So not only can you understand the selflessness of person, but you can also understand, or you can come to realize the selflessness of phenomena other than person. And in the lower systems, the Vaibhashika and the Sautantrika schools, well, the kind of selflessness they describe is also just a coarser version. They only talk about the self not existing as self-sufficient, substantially existent. So in other words, they refute the existence of a self-sufficient, substantially existent I. Whereas the higher schools go further. In particular, the high school, the Madhyamika school, also talks about the lack of an inherently existent I. That is the subtlest view when it comes to the self, the emptiness of the lack of, excuse me, an inherently existent I. And today's explanation, or the explanation Rinpoche will give in relation to this, in relation to this text, will be given from the point of view of the Madhyamika school, that is from the point of view of the lack of an inherently existent I, which is the highest view.
다 랑신 maybe 돈이 참으디 송용디 간라 돈이 참으디 다디로 돈이 참으디를 다 가서 땡진 저원 종스 땡진 저원 종 통마이나年路타도 통바래 땡진 저원 종 마 통바이나年路 타도 마 통바래 시시네 年路 타도디 랑신 매바 최단지 랑신 주로 뒤장 매바 디레디 디라 땡종 시시네 땡종스로 디간라다 치디 루치 차임 루쇼기 치차임 거로 랑신 매바스는데 가치 차임 거로 다 가베 취지를 띵종스이지네 루쇼니 타니 다용한테 가르스로 디간라 그냥 딜러 쿠랑 미세기 nen가 요레슨 거 가인스로 디간라 띵진 디원 종바 세기 띵종세디 띵세디 신라 템바세 랑신지 두바세디 신라 라마레바드레 yin la ra ma le ba ta xin la ra ma le ba se di ju de jin la ra ma le ba se di zang guo di ma re ta di ma yin bi xin la ra ma le bi cui qi guo re xin la me den ba di xin la den ba dang ngun ge cha di guo re xi za den jin de wan jong wa se lo ni ga den nen jong wa re se lo den ba se di xin la den ba di xin la den ba re se lo ni ga xin la me den ba di ngu ska tu guo re xie zang den se di rang xin ji zhu ba di ga ge re se jong se di rang xin ji zhu ba yo ma re rang xin me ba re se lo ni ga yang ka ji rang xin me ba re lo di ga me ba lo ku ru da kurangi rangi ngui gu ni zhu ba yo ma re pa zhe na nie yo ma se lo di ga la zhe ni nie me ba di nie me be tuan da ku ru da tenni me be tuan da lo ku ru go re da tenni me be tuan da lo ku ru di ni ga di sui ga go se na jong wa re se di tenni jong wa re se lo di ga la ani ji ba re se wo ro jong ye yo re ji ye yo re su ru zhu ye yo song yong di ga la ani me be che da lo hong ye gi ni ga di ga du go re se xie zang nian lu chang mo le ding zhong xie ji ni ro song ye di 丁中上比古年年路长木上呀地地里是卡苏了哈江给的手不记呢拼不起俺那山东那了其他给的拼都进不了的是拼都继续掉现在今年印度定进这完全话是的东尼长木了是定进这完全话是大量的东尼长木雇佣个为你讲了古土也就有的讲了东尼长木了 丁中死了的，这几年用过的是。
I see. Now, saying phenomena don't exist inherently. When we say phenomena lack inherent existence, well, that describes emptiness. That describes the subtle concept of emptiness. But with respect to dependent arising or dependent origination here we say dependent origination is necessary. Understanding dependent origination is necessary to understand emptiness, to understand the actual nature of phenomena. Because we don't understand dependent origination, we won't be able to understand the ultimate nature of phenomena, while understanding dependent origination, especially on its subtlest level, that enables us to understand, to realize, to recognize emptiness. Well, when we say inherent existence or the lack of inherent existence, the lack of inherent existence basically means there's nothing that exists in any way, that there's not even a speck of inherent existence when it comes to any phenomenon. There's nothing that can be found that exists in and of itself inherently. Now, when we talk about emptiness, that's non-affirmative. That's non-affirmative. We're negating, we're refuting or negating inherent existence. While dependent origination looks at the same thing, but from an affirmative standpoint, from an affirmative point of view. How is that significant? Well, when we say dependent origination, we're saying that whatever exists depends on something other than itself. While inherent existence, if something existed inherently, if it hypothetically were to exist inherently, it would not depend on anything else. So here, not dependent on anything else doesn't just include its own causes and conditions, but it includes anything. If something really were to exist inherently, it couldn't depend on anything other than itself. So therefore, it's important to understand, in order to understand emptiness, we need to understand, it's important to understand that everything that exists depends on something else. Because dependent and not independent are contradictory. So either phenomena depend on something else or they don't. So the word dependent origination, in particular the first term, dependent, that implies that phenomena are dependent on something other than themselves, which thereby negates inherent existence. On the other hand, then origination, the second term, that implies that phenomena exist. They come into existence. So they originated. Another term that is another translation for origination is arising. So it implies that not only do phenomena depend on other things, on things other than themselves, but they also arise. They are created. They come into existence. In that way, they must exist, which is helpful to understand or is important to understand because when we reflect on emptiness, when we reflect on the fact that phenomena don't exist inherently, well, some people may come to the conclusion that therefore nothing exists. They may fall into the extreme of nihilism that if something doesn't exist in and of itself or inherently, it must be non-existent. However, the term origination or the term arising, dependent arising, so arising implies that they did come, that they came into existence and that they do exist. Therefore, it's important to reflect on dependent arising or dependent origination. It's quite subtle, it's difficult to understand, but highly beneficial. It's extremely beneficial because it helps us to understand emptiness, which is why emptiness is sometimes described as the emptiness of dependent origination or the suchness of dependent origination. That's why we refer to emptiness in that way.
음. 다 지시에다 어디 딘데라고 지시. 다 딘디 뛰버랑 마시 유니가 다 딘디 뛰버디 쇼디 게시무 쉬우지 거래. 가레스 로디간라 다 딘디 뛰버디 디리. 시당 다 다기 공도 쉬워 나시 다음에 뵙된다디 베베기 나로라 우마벨 로지르다. 이요 다 지당 남배 나로라 지당 지와 있느다. 하버드 벽이 남배 이 시수당 다 야간 날린다기 개백이 시수디 패시 러축 위에는 간들 남배 따와기 나로라 따주 세 투슈디 우미 따와지예지. 우마베 따주디 공부루기 따와 디 다 가서 세 투슈를 지예디 요르다. 다 공부루기 따와딘 듯이 장님이 나로 라야지 다 참여기 다 가서 그래. 공부루두기 공부 신지 말로번 지투기레세 디 디레 가수 상제 가자 로벤 파발라 단 공부루두 나신 지기레스 다 야나로라 오마베 론징긴 수기 하나는 공부루두의 배 충분하다고 지기레스 파발라디 다 루두 여세니스는 콘나버니로 파발라던 공부루두니 다 콘나버니기 공부 지워라 배 초도 주고 용자다기 게다 차슌자버디 상제장단 나와자버디 다 게다 지슌자버디 기다 도 기다 니네도 차디거다 다 딩인디강라 바딘 나와자버다 로벤 상제장기 공부루두기 따와긴 지셰자난디 별라베 다 참매기 베 딜라 시부지 다 도나요레 다 딩인디강라 공부루두기 따와디 바딘 나와자베긴 지셰자야 디 베난 지셰자윤디강라 다 베베 캐바술라 미라오 용고르다 그 케베긴 지셰자디 미라 용고로 세상 딩용디강라 지단의 친부기 공부루두기 따와 공부루두기 숑당 파발라당 상제장당 나와자바당 딘제기베 루두 여생아 쉬고 그러베 딘제기 숑당 다나신기 자그르 케베 숑용주 베베기 나르지다 오마바 베베기 오마바 친부디주기 숑용주 제버체네 공부루두기 따와 상제종딘데기 공바 공부루두기 따와 빠덴 나와자베기 예수 지마지신지베 가수를吐了去年 但多주는 우미 따와 창了만나와 추바다 제와 디 줄을 총지지네 우미 따와 디 니용디 간라 니버 딜러 땡네 아니 상제 종된 될 미세기 대바지 총지지네 딘디 되버지 장바레스 디 낭터 나로라 디 송이거다
I see. Now, this completes the general kind of introduction. And now as to the actual text in Praise of Dependent Origination, well, this text by Lama Tsongkhapa is considered to be extremely important. As mentioned earlier, here it's the view of selflessness that's considered to be so important, and the view that we follow here is in accordance with the Madhyamika, or the middle way philosophical school. The explanation you find in the middle way philosophical school, or the Madhyamika school, is the explanation we follow here, or that is followed here in this particular text, which is based on the teachings of Nagarjuna. Now, in the Tibetan tradition, in the Nalanda tradition in general, the highest explanation, or the most profound explanation that is considered to be the explanation given by Nagarjuna. Nagarjuna's view is the most profound view, and is said to be the actual view when it comes to emptiness. But then Nagarjuna also had a disciple called Ayadeva. And Ayadeva and Nagarjuna are viewed in a similar way. They're said to be similar in terms of their understanding, in terms of their profound understanding of the text. So there's not much difference between the two. And then the Tibetan tradition and the Nalanda tradition follows the explanations of Nagarjuna and Ayadeva. And then the Nagarjuna and Ayadeva, well, there's some commentators who wrote their texts on the basis of Nagarjuna and Ayadeva's view, and most prominent are Buddhapalita and Chandrakirti. Now, these four are seen as really important in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition: Nagarjuna, Ayadeva, Buddhapalita, and Chandrakirti. And when Buddhism came to Tibet, well, there were many different views when it came to the writing of Nagarjuna, Ayadeva, Buddhapalita, and Chandrakirti. And of these different views, well, Lama Tsongkhapa was one of the authors of important commentaries on the view of emptiness based on Nagarjuna, Ayadeva, Buddhapalita, and Chandrakirti. So he read their texts, he studied their texts, and gained an unmistaken understanding of the explanations found in the texts by Nagarjuna and so forth. Therefore, as a result of that, gaining this profound understanding of emptiness and dependent arising, he developed great faith in the Buddha. He developed incredible faith in the Buddha, who had given the original teachings based on which Nagarjuna and so forth wrote their texts. So this is how it's explained in Lama Tsongkhapa's biography. That was the reason he composed this text, due to his incredible faith and devotion in the Buddha, based on his teachings on emptiness and dependent arising.
마세베 다 딘디드버기 숑디 가서 올디 시버린도 된다 니 망부지 니가 망부지 din 상 딩이지 오미 다외기 된다기 가서 올다 니 친구 오미 다와라지 고 투모 마인바 지킨기 된다 디수 제디안 디낭로라다 외대바 숑 하장기 망부딘데 말이디 간다 된다 성미 오미 다와든지 된다 니 더 치리 치세 엔디 나로는 뒤딩이지 배차천바 이나 디오디라 가서 그래 강도선 시바나 당진 치워 딩시바 디니 켈로 주의 자오만리 주의 구세 페이지 딩바유 양오오디라 디오리다 자와티 카오토 강도中写完了唐人情况地你开了住朝嘛的距离过地的这是地送的在地嘛因不样地送不多血迹毛纹他们不同意就身体用的地嘛的可是唐人情况地嘛的就身体卡多钱嘛积累技能的些呗通达嘛通公布了更多把的工地及各个人等这些路今年地送也机械真心新年里送吧，确实技术老把了古巴堂姐是年间早我读书了，确实电了小学呗，一人要我电些讲，电些讲，谢谢卷的比我就打的到我电学了噻，那就说人家修差别是，但因为人等到菜的里面的，但是吃现在的是对吧？你看到这个招嘛的节目地方。电年将有几成绩，他到我了没的，雷松电年间出去，马瓦拉诺没有就谁去，是吧？但是地主这里，但地大不了说吧，利息定的对外南路的吃地主这里还来不开心么？这样被国土么嘛也不行，俺说了带出去，但在当地给希腊给当地，总算刚都算也，
Samaras.
我的，你看地主送了，地嘛也不。
So this text in praise of dependent origination gives so many different explanations. It offers a lot of different aspects, or it describes different aspects when it comes to emptiness and dependent origination, which makes this text so important. It's not very long, but it contains so many different explanations, so many helpful explanations, in particular when it comes to the middle way view. Now, Rinpoche just quickly gave a few examples that may be helpful. For instance, verse number 6, by grasping at it, the childish strength and bondage to extreme views. For the wise, this very fact is the doorway to cut free from the net of elaborations. And then verse 29, Rinpoche cited then verse 29. Why is this so? Because by declaring these chances for reification and denigration towards things seen and unseen are made most remote. Likewise, verse 31, or the 31st verse, you who speak excellently by seeing as it is, for those who train in your footsteps, all degenerations will become remote, for the root of all faults will be undone. And then it continues in verse 32, but those who turn away from your teaching, though they may struggle with hardship for a long time, faults increase evermore as if being called forth, for they make firm the view of self. So these verses are all very important, but one of the most important verses is verse 19. In verse 19, it says, it is through the reason of dependent origination that one does not lean towards an extreme. That you have declared this excellently is the reason, O Savior, of your being an unexcelled speaker. So these are just some of the examples of this text, or of this text being so profound. It gives you kind of a rough sense of why some of these verses, though different, describing different aspects, but still extremely helpful in terms of fully understanding the concept of dependent arising suchness. So the verses Rinpoche read were verse 6, verse 29, verse 31, and verse 32, all of them being very important, but Rinpoche considers verse 19 to be most important. So verse 19. So Rinpoche may have gone to see the workers. Sometimes a little unpredictable in India. If they say they come today, then they come the next day. And unfortunately, they came today. So, well, Rinpoche is giving teachings.
Di ma yin ba, yana tanda di. Nguyu zhu na, din zhu ba ju da jin la du barang ge. Di gang la, du me na ka mi du ji, din na ma din yue ma yin is. Xin la ra ma le ba di yo ma, din nin zhong wa sha da res, din ba res, rang xin zhu ba yo ma res. Nguyu zhu na, din zhu ba ju da jin la du barang ge. Di, ju jin la du ne, ji gu wo res, ji jin di song yung di gang la, gu din zhong se di song yung gu duwa, xe di su zhe di, ci, nian ga qin bu xi bu qia ge mian zhuo sang gu du.
Another verse that Rinpoche considers to be really important is verse 14, which reads, the non-contingent is like a sky flower. Hence, there's nothing that is not dependent. If things exist through their essence, their dependence on causes and conditions for their existence is a contradiction. These words, they specifically point out dependence on causes and conditions, that impermanent phenomena depend on causes and conditions. So Rinpoche considers this to be another important verse.
Din zhu duwa ngu ni ma tsin zhe du zi jia ba yin na, tsin zhe si la gu re ma, zhi xie jia gi qin ba yin na.
Nasi.
Ngu di di ro, ta din zhu duwa yin zhi xie pe mang bu du. Yin na ya tanda di gin lang rin ba, zhe bong gi gin lang rin ba yu ba. Kong gi din zhu duwa yin zhi xie nang lo la, din zhu duwa gi da ngu gi chue ju di da, chue ba ju ba rang re, xiong mu xi di ge cha guwa ma re. xiong mu xi di, zhen zhen ni xu zang an na lo gu xia jia ni xie xia. Di, zhen zhen ni xu zang an na gu xia jia ni xie di ma ri 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 ji lu qin ba yin na, de zi lu le nye di bu sun de cha ge du, xie zang nye di xi xia an da wu ji xin ni xue yi.
Nasi. Now, Rinpoche will start from the beginning. We'll give an explanation of each verse, starting with verse 1. And there are different types, different ways to comment on these verses. And the commentary that Rinpoche chose is by someone called Kadam Rinpa from Jamyang Monastery. And in his book, well, first he gives some kind of he starts his commentary with a word of homage, which doesn't include any of the verses of in praise of dependent origination, and then after after his verse of or his expression of homage, he then divides the text into 25 sections, and within these 25 sections he explains the verses of in praise of dependent origination. And Rinpoche finds this commentary on Lama Tsongkhapa's text is very helpful. It's a very good commentary.
당연히 나랑기 룰을 차야지 쉬워이너다. 딘디 뒤베기 가르송구도스나 딘종기 디쿠나니 세 딘종기 동반이 세디 송고다 도도디 송고다. 다 딘종기 동반이 송용디간라 다 ngu기 최주기 슐루가 지디 판도스 가사 상제 종딘데라 딘진데 원종 송바 인장 다 할레버지 송바레 디 송야데 할레버지 송바레 시지네 딘종 송베군이 되버디 슐루가 지티제 다디마 오디니 숑무시디 간데 송용구도스나 간데 딘종기 디코나니 송교여바시 도도 지티 된다 지시고 딘종기 디코나니 딘종기 동반이 쓰시고 다디 간데 시에버를 어디간라 숑무시기 구당보디네 딘종기 동반이 세디 가츠지 계신부 임바 그러와 가츠지 계신부 임바 딘종기 디 된지 가츠지 계신부 임바디 지제 근데 딘종기 디코나니 세디 가서 그래 유천 강라 되네 강라 되네 딘종기 디고나니 통그래 유천 강라 되네 딘종기 디고나니 통야디 유천 다랑라 되네 세와 수수지 우디 주제디 딘종기 디고나니 도쇼 다트 주번 젠로 그레스 로 간도 유천지라 되네 유천지부 다랑 케발라 돈이 고야기 털은 주제지 주천 다랑 세바 수수지 우디소라 다 주바 임베 랑신지 주바 임베 주천의 파통대지 딘레지 용디 거레스 다디고 강사 수수기 루이 체버지 왕래 딘레 용고레스 지송 다디네마 아니 딘종 동반이 네루 참 다메바디 고시기 주센스는 내가 타도버디 딘진도 원종세 차디고 딜러 딘에 다음에 구용거로 그래서 딘제기 딘종기 된다데 시용디가라 아니 수다 수기 딘종 시에벌 딘에 강사 수다 수기 다음에 뭐 구투고 말했을 러인디가라 다디 딘종 시용디가라 오 딘종이나 랑시지메바 인식 말했을 지지네다 딘종 다스고 용디가라 야나 랑신지메바 이원 개개 다래 양나 딘종 주신 시에버디 수주 마주바리 딘종 인바 마주바리 말했지 마주베 딘시 야나 딘종 인야 랑신지메바 인고 말했지 망이베 딘시는 되긴 디수제디기 통도 말했어 세상 당원의 수통도 그랬으나 오 랑신메바의 딘종님부 딘게메도 고통이기 강사 디수제디 딘종이 디고나니 통도 그랬어 디송 안 딘종이 디고나니 디 간데스 딘종이 디고나니 디 간데스 통그래 디기 된다데 가레스 된다데 레질스 그래서 딘종이 디고나니 된다지 송 그래서 딘데 송인 것도 아니 다나 생기 가데 지다니 지뭐 코나 라니기 딘종이 디고나니 디 강라 딘네 통여봐 딘종이 디고나니 디다 숑루 가르라 딘네 통여봐 아니 딘종이 디고나니 추여거라 강에 가르쳐여봐 디주 송용구도 간다 디자마스야 딘종이 디고나니 디 상제기 송기 힘부디 임바 디주 제디 송용구다 고랭이 디데 다다 데마송디 간다 된다 디주 제디 송용구다
Yes. Now, Rinpoche says, according to his own understanding, when it comes to Genlam Rinpoche's explanation or this commentary, well, he basically talks about, well, first of all, the emptiness of dependent arising or dependent arising empty. Well, I should translate it as suchness of dependent arising or suchness or emptiness of dependent arising. Now, here he starts off with homage to the Buddha. In his commentary, starts off with saying how amazing that the Buddha taught this, that the Buddha taught dependent arising. This is so special. This is so incredible. That is just the verse of homage. And then he starts to talk about the actual text starts, as said earlier, with the 25 sections. So the actual text starts. And he's basically saying, well, this suchness of dependent origination, that is so important. It's so important, and explains how this concept is important. He describes the way in which this is so relevant, is so significant. So dependent origination, or suchness of dependent origination, why is it so important, and why do we need to understand it? But he also goes into details on the fact that actually sometimes the same reason can be understood to mean that therefore phenomena lack inherent existence, or can be understood to mean that therefore phenomena do exist inherently. In other words, those well versed in the text, those adepts, so those scholars and so forth, they understand it depends on their particular reason. They understand that phenomena cannot exist inherently, while ordinary beings would take the same reason, would use the same reason, and see this reason, or understand this reason, to mean that phenomena have to exist inherently. Due to their lack of understanding, they misunderstand the reasoning set forth. So this is just a matter of different minds looking at things in a different way. But anyway, the subtlest view is the view of dependent, was the view of the suchness of dependent origination. And it's based on that view that we can really understand selflessness. Now, to give you an example of, like, in the form of a syllogism, if you were to say a certain phenomenon doesn't exist inherently because has dependently arisen. That would be a logical kind of statement, which can be misunderstood by those who are not well versed with the explanations given by the Buddha. So, for instance, they may feel that, well, because something exists in dependence on other phenomena, it must exist inherently. They perceive the opposite, that this, according to them, the reason of dependent origination proves the opposite, not the lack of inherent existence, but inherent existence. Or they have the view that phenomena are not dependently arisen, not that a phenomenon does not depend on other things. So in that way, they would refute the fact that a particular phenomenon is dependently arisen, has dependently arisen. Or they would think that something that has arisen in dependence on something else, it doesn't necessarily lack inherent existence. So instead of saying it must be inherently existent, they say, well, it's not necessarily inherently existent. So they're just different wrong views when it comes to citing dependent origination or dependent arising as the reason. Some understand, based on dependent arising, that especially on the subtlest level, they understand that phenomena cannot exist inherently. They see no contradiction, dependent origination and lack of inherent existence. So anyway, the text then describes how do you understand emptiness on the basis of dependent origination. And likewise, the commentary also goes on to say, goes on to explain how Lama Tsongkhapa, what kind of text did he read, and what kind of problems did he encounter in his effort to understand dependent origination, in his effort to understand emptiness based on dependent origination. And the main point the author Genlam Rinpa basically makes is that dependent origination is the quintessential teaching. The teachings on dependent origination are the quintessential teachings of the Buddha.
다 된다 님부지디 가르송 연구도 쓰는 다 띵아술라 할레베 케치무 차거든. 다가 세디 제네 니에메데 봐. 그러 뭐 유튜브 추투바 추투베 nga tinde chi yo mares lui da ba zang de ma du nga su nga gang de nang yue xi di le nga nang go nga su nga se su su nang di go nga di nang yue di nang yue nga di ma du是nang yue xi di le nang sa gi xi di le ngo ga jin na nie me be da me be tuan da di gu yong di gang la 차당 지에 이 시창만 캔 주고 차당 자원의 지에 매부 창조 디네 손디 신의 시와 마수 신투데 당 심보마지 외차 자원이 매부 디네 손디 단 넘버 땡의 시와 차리 시디 타투가 디용고라 또 다양 다메버디 시러 비제 당네 다메비 된다 구디가나 낭주 매부 말해 낭주 에 하르투 비제 당네 다메비 된 구디가 낭주 비제 당 차당 미지워치 차당 지워디 센투 용거로 다 센자원이 투에 매비 띵드 시워디 차야 디송 용거도 다 띵디 되베기 된다 도도 어디 송 용거도 할레베 계시
Let's see. So in essence, therefore, dependent arising, dependent origination is so important. We need to understand that the self, the way we perceive it, the I, the way we perceive it, it just cannot be found. Such a self-sustaining, such a self that seems to exist in and of itself is impossible. Instead, the self does exist as being merely labeled. And what appears to our mind, that merely appearing I, well, there is no basis for it. It just cannot be found. It simply cannot be in any way found to exist. It's impossible. And so once we understand that basis, based on which we generate self-grasping and so forth, that is not found, well, then attachment cannot arise. Attachment, aversion, none of these can arise. And our mind won't be stressed out the way it is right now. We won't have these stressful, these disturbed states of mind, because the basis that it's been understood that its basis is just not there. And none of the mental afflictions can therefore function once this is properly understood. And it's wisdom that we need to apply. We need to use our own intelligence, our own wisdom, to fully understand this. Of the mental afflictions, when they take hold in our mind, they just disrupt our mind. They just disturb our mind. They stress us out, basically. Yes.
다 띵디 되베 추주디 강시 지시 송이 친다 덴발라나메 자와 띵진 저 지긴도마 딜란디 송야디 되베 유디 자와 다 뒤실의 자와 메팅베 쇼탄제의 자와 상제 중딩 대시 딜라 되바래 강기 군이 되바랬으나 땡종기 디쿠나니 집에 침발라노메바다 덴바 땡종기 디쿠나니 랑왕기 군인 동버제바 뜸버제바 신지자 니지 진행아 튜두스르지 많이 받지 미신다지자 안주니 디 룰라 신 디마 가서 리피트 지버스는데 되게 많이 봐. 그렇죠? 땡종기 된탄지 문송도 문도 주네 문도 제네 지다와신의 신의 랑왕기 군인 동버제바 세상 땡종기 디쿠나니 손제바 인장 뜸발라노 메바 이바 침발라노 메바다 뜸발라노 메바다 강시 집에 침발라노 메바디 띵종기 디고나니 강시 손베 뜸발라노 메바 창조에 디야 띵종기 디고나니래 오디 뜸발라노 메바다 침발라노 메바다 덴베 상제 종딘데라 가서 침발라노 메바 침발라노 메바 뜸발라노 메바디 강기 군이 차버 띵종송의 군이 차버래 세상 띵종 랑왕기 군이 동바다 띵종 응원송도 지시 랑왕도 동바 제베 상제了 두두是 어디를 된다 되는 거지.
Let's see. So now, if you look at the text, well, verse 1 is Lama Tsongkhapa's verse of homage. He pays homage to the Buddha by saying, "He who speaks on the basis of seeing, this makes him a knower and teacher unexcelled. I bow to you, O conqueror, you who saw dependent origination and taught it." So in this praise, or in this verse of homage, Lama Tsongkhapa says, well, the Buddha is someone who has understood, who has realized, who's come to know dependent origination and then taught it to others. But what's very important is that he understood this on his own accord, not depending on the words of someone else, for instance. So it wasn't like someone else taught him about dependent origination and he just passed on what he had understood based on these words and taught it to others. But instead, he gained a direct perception, a direct realization of what emptiness and dependent origination means, or in particular, what dependent origination means. And based on that, on his own accord, based on his own realizations, without depending on anyone else, he then passed it on. He then spoke about it to others. So this makes him a knower and teacher unexcelled. So on the basis, he basically taught on the basis of what he himself understood, the Buddha himself had realized, he then taught. And so that makes him such a knower and teacher unexcelled, in particular, because of having realized dependent origination, having directly realized it and taught it to others. So therefore, Lama Tsongkhapa, for that reason, he bows to the Buddha. That's what the first verse describes, or what the first verse means.
다디 오디니마 다기 강의 디송 바로 최주 거수 땡종이 디고나니 집에 침바 라노메 바레스. 침바 딜레베 가수 그래. 공나 메바. 침바 탈투바 드레스라 버다. 땡종이 디고나니 침바 여바이나 땡종이 디고나니 시바 있는다. 케바 탈투바 드레스 바로. 다 땡종이 디고나니 랑왕 군는 동물 제바 있는 템발라노메 랑가 땡킹기 나로라 겐라기 나로라 겐라 다 겐라 가수르다 야슈디스라 구레 아메나 겐라 타르투바디 다 기겐 짜치슈디스라 버다 다디 레손니 디 주센딘디니 마송용 것도 다니 미제라 숑무시스 그래 숑무시디 된다디 니슈 된다 니슈 장아레 지송샤긴 라닝베디 구디부도 상거도 그래서 다 띵종이 디고나니 집에 침바 인자 침바 라노메바 당 디템베 템바 라노메바 차단디 간데르러디 지딘 고바 지니바 디 자오 마리디스 고바 탄제기 자오 마리바레스 둥에 탄제기 자오 코에 다 둥에스라고 그래 다 강에 참목이 자오 마리바레스 디 가리톤의 마리바디 도토르는 띵종기 디고나니레스 띵진도 원종이 말이스
Now, with regard to verse 1, it says he's the unexcelled knower. So the Tibetan word here implies unexcelled or unsurpassable. Like basically there's no one beyond the Buddha when it comes to the knowledge of dependent origination. So therefore the Buddha is described, well, you may want to say the best kind of, or the ultimate teacher, the unsurpassable teacher, in particular with regard to teaching dependent origination. Now that is the verse of homage, and so previously, I made a mistake. I thought Rinpoche said it was the homage by Genlam Rinpa, but actually Genlam Rinpa in his text described the homage first, and then starting with the actual text, which starts with verse number 2, then that text is divided into 25 sections. So now verse 1, the verse of homage, has been covered, and now according to Genlam Rinpa's commentary, there are 25 sections, or by way of 25 sections, Genlam Rinpa explains the remaining verses. So here, what is said in verse number 2, well, whatever degenerations there are in the world, the root of all these is ignorance. You taught that it is dependent origination, the seeing of which will undo this ignorance. So in other words, degenerations here mean sufferings, all the problems in this world. Well, what is their root? What is their main cause? It is ignorance with regard to the ultimate nature of phenomena. So the Buddha, therefore, so why, basically it's saying, why is such a knower? Why is such an unexcelled knower? Because he explained exactly that the root cause of all our trouble is that misconception of reality of the self and other phenomena, and that the Buddha taught it that exactly that dependent origination, because of his teachings on dependent origination, that therefore, once we understand this, we can overcome ignorance.
다디 오디네 슐루가 지기다 딘데 인상 공기 주생 딜러 땡네 아니 땡종기 디구나니 세디 상제기 땡베 힘불라 땡베기 베 쏟아버 로 상제기 송취 나야기 나로라 다 송취기 낭된 조티原来的 디인바 간데스 이 디인바 간데스 통구마르 통그레스 디송도 다 딘데 이마 인디간라 엔 땡종기 디구나니 송베군이 되야디 사 상제로 뛰어 피당 뛰어 가서 그래 피당다 세 투슈디 상제로 뛰어지 표어이나 딘종송 요군에 뛰어 디군이 피나 개버수기 디군이 피그르마도 신다기 군에 뛰어 간데스 피그레 스타 간다 딘종군이 피에디 디레스 가서 그래 다 rin슈스라고 청슈 서슈 어디 차디 거레스 디송도 슐가 오마디 딘 디간라 딘종레 하베 모스 딘종기 디구나니 하베 모스 친구지 니에요 말레스 딘종기 디구나니레 딜레 딘종기 디구나니 송바 딜레 야쳔바지데 딜레 모스 치오지 요 말레스 강가진라 라레바 디디랑지 지동스 진라 라레바 진리 지바 참마 동바레 송에 딘제기 딘종기 디구나니 송바 딜레 모스 치오다 딜레베 당아된 디 하바 서버지당 뒤절만 당아 딜레 가서 서버진 마 당아 동면 동버스는 만나야지 가봐 요래서 어디 송부터 다 딘체기 지단이 지금 코랑기 상제를 뛰어버디 딘종송요군이 뛰어버래 딘종송요군이 뛰어구비 주센디 단다기 슐거 수제디 송그레서 어디 송도
나세 단르무시 소야디 졸라가 숨바시바다 nga바라 강하게 나라레바 디바도체라
디디랑지 송 린돈순이 지시유에서 디바도
레론순이 지슈 당기 차선 인식에 돌아 로나디라
네
No, so Rinpoche didn't read verse number 3, 4, and 5, but explained it. But I'll just read it. Ask Rinpoche for permission. So these 3 verses. So how can an intelligent person not comprehend that this path of dependent origination is the essential point of your teaching? This being so, who will find, O Savior, a more wonderful way to praise you than to praise you for having taught this origination through dependence? Whatsoever depends on condition that is devoid of intrinsic existence, what excellent instructions can there be more amazing than this proclamation? So with these words, Rinpoche explained that, or he gave the reason why the Buddha is praiseworthy. The Buddha should be praised for his teachings on dependent origination. I mean, the reason for why he was such an amazing, he's such an unsurpassable knower in the sense that of all the reasons, there are so many different reasons for why the Buddha could be praised, but here the main reason, really, the most profound reason, the best reason would really be because the Buddha taught dependent origination. So this is what these words are basically saying. Where could there be a greater teaching than the teaching on dependent origination? What excellent instructions can there be more amazing than this? And of course, then also, as it says that whatever depends on conditions. So this is a form of dependent origination that Lama Tsongkhapa here describes, a kind of dependence. But in short, it is these 5 verses, these 3 verses just give us a sense of the reason for why, the best reason for why the Buddha should be praised. And that's it. That's the end of it. So we got to verse number 5. So Rinpoche will end the teachings today.